Welcome back, you hear of Goldberg. Today we'll be talking about Blackout by Candace Owens. This has been long requested, and I can certainly understand why it's so popular amongst viewers of Fox News and readers of Breitbart. It truly checks every necessary box to be this vehicle for the new ides of conservatism in the Republican Party. In fact, you can tell there is an impact or influence of Dinesh D'Souza on her text. That isn't to say it's poorly written, but as I've noted before, conservatism has a very self-serving and selective interpretation of history as to what conservatism stood for in the past or stood against. So we'll just bring up what she argues and then some other information that probably needs to be mentioned because she's not going to do it and most conservatives refuse to. All right. One of her first points is that welfare destroyed the black family structure. And while you can't deny welfare plays a role, since the 1996 welfare reform, its impact has been grossly exaggerated. I did a whole blog post explaining what the modern welfare system consists of, so you can check that out. But one must admit, they never talk about how the economic system, where people are increasingly living in these marginal positions, may in fact have contributed equally, if not more so, to the breakdown of families, whether black, white, Asian, Hispanic, whichever. In the 1970s especially, and going forward, you had these conservative economic interests that were pushing for deregulation, that were pushing for an economic model that really fixated on performance for the stock market, for shareholders, not necessarily what's in the best interest of the company as a whole. So you have offshoring, you have the rating of profitable pension and healthcare funds, you have spinning off of these obligations to retired workers so they can declare bankruptcy and only pay pennies on the dollar of what they had promised and could still afford if they were playing by the rules. You can't dismiss all of that and say it has no impact. Oh, that's just victimhood. But that's what conservatives will do. Not to mention, and I'll be doing a video in the future, it's already recorded, it's on how feminism in many ways is a byproduct of the economic system. So you can look at stats in the past and say the black family was more tightly knit. But you're talking about a time period where less women worked in general. They were more dependent on their fathers or their husbands for income. Now you have women going to college, they're getting jobs of their own, they can earn their own keep. Why exactly would they then turn around and want to just stay within the household? And this is something that a lot of these simps don't talk about. Conservatives certainly don't, because that goes against the essence of their, pro-economic freedom model. So it just has to be mentioned. Then, of course, she brings up something which we heard from Mitt the Banana Romney back in, I think, 2007, where he said, we need more black fathers. And this is a good example of conservatives not understanding what's really going on. So if you actually study the slave system, and there's a good book, it's called To Shoot Hard Labor. It's actually an account from Barbados, but that was a similar system to the one in the United States. If a black man had a kid, of course it became the property of the slave owner, and the slave owner pretty much had control over that kid's destiny. He would get to name them. It would essentially be his son. If he wanted to educate the kid, it was, within his purview. So by definition, you have black men getting cucked. And you say, well, that's just because of the law, but it was also a private economic system. They were treated like property, correct? So it's so easy for conservatives to say you need more fathers, but in a way, that entire slave system that was based upon a conservative aristocracy has shaped much of black culture to this day, where they have the stereotype of the distant black father. So this is stuff that has to be acknowledged as well, not just, oh, it's irrelevant because it's victimhood. Well, no, it's part of history. A lot of conservatives seem to pretend that you can have this slavery model for so many years, and then once the slaves are freed, all that culture, all that identity that was constructed, black American identity, just disappears because now you're just a person in the capitalist economy pursuing wealth and prosperity and Reaganism. There's more to it than just some vague ideal or claim about freedom and democracy. She says that conservatism is about survival, leftism is about having too much time on your hands, so you get into this over-civilization of like the trans stuff and whatnot. But it's weird, she supports gay marriage, so this is a good indication of what was the whole deal back in 2004? We need a federal marriage amendment. We can't let these gays get married. It's going to destroy society. Then, once Obama comes in and they stop defending DOMA, it becomes a states' rights issue. Every state has the right to say whether or not you can get married. And then, once it becomes the law of the land, so-called, now you have conservatives like Candace Owens saying that they support gay marriage. But the trans stuff is too far. We can't go there. You're like, well, so you're basically taking advantage of what these liberal reformers, progressives pushed for, you did activism for, and now you're saying, oh, it's conservative. So we take ownership of what is now mainstream and popular, but we can't go further to this more obscure thing that isn't necessarily popular yet. It's just kind of fascinating. I've noticed this with conservatives. She notes that Republicans, conservatives care about a person for their whole life. So this is the concept of caring for the unborn and then caring for their opportunities after they're actually, coming into the world. Whereas the Democrats, I guess, don't really care about people because they support abortion, or they just see people as these drones to vote for them. And there's kind of an interesting dynamic with that because obviously Republicans are known for not really wanting environmental protections, for not wanting like regulations on how food is produced, for being war hawks in many cases. So you're like, you really care about them throughout their lives. She says, oh, these kids who were fighting in Vietnam and fighting in World War I and II, I mean, what were we fighting for these kids to do the trans stuff now or whatever? And that's kind of interesting, at least in the context of Vietnam. I mean, you can go back to World War I. We were basically fighting to protect certain empires from other empires. In World War II, we overthrew fascism so that communism could rule half the world for decades and oppress people. And, with Vietnam or Iraq, I just bring this up, the image, because she's associated with Turning Point, and that was Rob Smith. It was a couple of years ago. Those Groyper clowns were saying, oh, he's gay or whatever. And he just was going, yo, I'm fighting for your freedom, bitches. And he's like, how is fighting in Iraq preserving the freedom of Americans? So you still have this line from these conservatives where they'll take any military conflict, no matter how, far removed from the interests of the United States, and claim that if you fought in it, you were fighting for freedom. It's just astonishing to me, the power of political manipulation and fake patriotism or fake nationalism. Then she says that socialism kills. And, no question. Of course, how do you define socialism? The Scandinavian countries, which are mixed economies, but are described and derided as socialistic by certain American politicians, they're not killing their people en masse. In fact, people tend to be fairly happy in those countries, although they don't get as much sunlight, so that's kind of a negative. And then you're going to have regimes like Pinochet or Jorge Videla that are more capitalist-oriented, but they do kill some people. So unless you're saying capitalism is uniquely about freedom and democracy, people are still being killed. Then you could take to the extent and say, what about pollution? What about how food is produced and obesity? I know it's an individual choice to consume certain things, but then again, if most of the products are all controlled by one company or a few companies and they have the same practices and you're getting sick from them, is capitalism culpable for those deaths as well? In the context of Venezuela, it's interesting because she says, they closed the border. They wouldn't take humanitarian aid. It's like, well, should they be taking handouts from someone else? I don't know. I just think it's kind of interesting with the whole conservatives to stand on their own 2 feet. But the socialists didn't want the aid, mainly for political reasons, but still. Later on in the book, she says, we, as in black people, need the government to help us end slavery, voting rights, civil rights, that sort of thing. But then we started worshiping government too much. And what's kind of interesting with that is that, again, it's that selective comprehension of history. The Democrats were the party of the KKK and they opposed civil rights. Well, no, because a lot of it was passed because of a Democratic president and certain Southern Democrats who flipped to be on his side. But even there, Republicans in the early 1900s, if you're going by modern conservative definitions, they were a Northeastern pro-big business party. But at the same time, you had the Teddy Roosevelt Republicans, the progressives, who wanted more regulation, who wanted more taxes, more welfare. So would that be an example of a modern Republican? Like, they all want to take the mantle of Lincoln, who, by the way, was, by certain opinions, violating states' rights. He was a dictator. He's a Republican, but then you've got the progressive Republicans, who I guess you kind of move out of the category, and then you fast forward to the conservative Republicans, even though Barry Goldwater was opposed to the Civil Rights Act because he said it was violating private association and business rights. So, again, conservatives are not honest about history. They just go around trying to graft themselves onto anything that's mainstream and popular, even though in many cases they would have opposed it in that context. So yeah, this selective amnesia really irritates me, because if you really consider conservatism historically, it has always been about defending the aristocracy. That's what it means. You have an established model, so you defend the monarchy. You say, for instance, in the Free State of Prussia under Germany, they said the Junkers, the big landowners, you had to own property in order to vote. But not just that, you had to have, based upon what you paid in taxes, your vote weighed more. So this is something that a lot of these clowns in the manosphere advocate. And they don't realize that when you have a society that is dominated and ruled by elites in that way, if it's profitable for them, they will lead you into war because they can make money off of human suffering. This has happened throughout history, and they'll say it's about patriotism, it's about nationalism, whatever, but that's what they'll do. And you'll be sitting there like, yeah, but conservatism is about defending the established order. But once the order changes, then conservatism adapts to, well, now we can't go any further than this. So in a lot of respects, conservatism defending the aristocracy. With slavery, a lot of conservative positions was to defend the slave system. She says, like, segregation, no, that's not conservative. Well, who are you to say that the federal government should step in and tell states or localities how they have to run their school system? You see how, depending on the perspective, you're not really a conservative, you're like this activist, progressive, or leftist? They never put it into context in that way. With education, and this is something I brought up before, Mazzini in the 1850s was calling out the United States and saying, look at the hypocrisy. They'll tell you that a black person's inferior, but when the black person tries to pursue education, they'll come around and say, no, you can't have education, it's a waste because you're inferior. But if someone's inferior, why are you afraid of them getting education? Probably because they might no longer be as inferior. They might be a threat to you. So this is again where you see conservatives are myopic. They don't understand history. They just are in the temporal position. They will take a position. They'll take, a stand, and that will change based upon when and what period they're operating in, which is why conservatism doesn't really represent anything at all. It's just, well, we can go there, but not too quickly. We'll take credit for everything that the reformers have done, that the risk takers have pursued, but then we don't want to go any further. And when they try to act like, okay, everything's taken care of, slavery's over, people have opportunities for jobs, they leave out the fact that oftentimes it took very violent struggles. The Civil War was a very violent struggle. You can read the Rudolph Rocker's book on syndicalism. The number of people died in the UK just trying to get better protections in the workplace. And this was violence, yes, in many cases sanctioned by the state, but who was representing the state? Who was backing the state? industrialists and rich landowners because they had the voting power. So conservatism, you have to look past the slogans, you have to look at the history, otherwise you just end up kind of randomly advocating for things that, from the standpoint of what has actually occurred, it's just grossly inaccurate. With that being said, this book, it was interesting. You will learn something, but just understand when you hear a lot of these conservative talking points, they are self-serving and they're not the best students of history.